To me, the question is not that interesting. Like, is Donald Trump worse than Joe Biden? Or is Donald Trump, like, does he have worse views than Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi? For me, the question in politics is, who's likely to do the most damage? And I think one of the big divisions in liberal left politics is how you view Donald Trump. Like, did you view him as this kind of unprecedented, fascistic or even Hitlerian type figure who...
That was a really weird way of framing that, because he was like, I don't like when we have these conversations where it's not interesting to me who would be worse between Donald Trump or Joe Biden. To me, we have to look at who will do more damage. And now I'm going to compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden. I'm going to watch Mr. Glenn Greenwald debate Nathan J. Robinson in the debatosphere. Oh yes, for you see, Glenn Greenwald is calling me out on my shit on Wednesday. He's very upset about a video I made that accuses him of being funded by Big Horse for his takes on ivermectin. So before that event, I would like to watch a lot of Glenn Greenwald and get to know him a little bit more and what he believes. Big Horse, the Big Horse lobby. I believe he has a permanent stable on the Council of Cows, and so he's quite upset about that. He's quite upset that a lot of journalists in Brazil, who are obviously not a big fan of Glenn Greenwald because he's kind of a piece of shit over there now, they basically really liked the video and they shared it a lot, and then he got really upset about that too. So he wants to talk to me about it. So I figured I'd let him, because I am always open to defending my comedy. I do not believe personally in jokes just for the lulz and then backing away from that. I think if you are a comedian, you should be able to explain your humor, explain your comedy, and what was the purpose and what was the messaging behind that comedy. Because at the end of the day, yes, you can be transgressive or you can be racist as a comedian, but you should be able to stand behind it. It's still your form of speech. There's still a message behind it, even if it's subtle or ridiculous or slathered in something bizarre, you know? Him and Mike have the same thing in common. They both have got upset by my memes. A few people have been upset by my memes. I'm gonna have to shut that meme channel down. It's been nothing but trouble.
Attacked on the internet are people who come at it with an extremely confident approach, which is like, I'm voicing the un-PC opinions that nobody wants to hear, and you all just want to call me names and fuck you, right? And to me, that exacerbates the problem.
Is that how you feel Jesse's behaved?
I do kind of feel that way, yeah.
Even if it's like 30 people or 20 people who are like horrifically murdered or raped because of prosecutorial reform, that is a cost to those policies that should be included in the debate.
You know why it's misleading to point to those costs.
Are there reforms that you favor or that Nathan favors that would undermine liberalism in the Democratic Party as opposed to strengthening it?
Yeah, because we're principled opponents of censorship, as we've said. And, you know, even if that, I don't think Trump should be banned from Facebook, for example. But, you know, even though I like, not having to hear him, but I think there's a principled reason to let him speak.
I am really excited to be joined here today with two people who have, frankly, personally played a really formative role in my professional development as a journalist and politico of sorts. Nathan Robinson, founder of Current Affairs Magazine, the first person, I believe, or one of the first people to ever publish me and put me on the map. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
So nice to be back with you, Bree.
And Glenn Greenwald, one of the founders of The Intercept, another journalistic institution that has been so kind enough as to hire me, and who is now independent, Pulitzer Prize winning, plaudits up the wazoo, who's shown an enormous...
I like Nathan. I do too. It's just, it sucks about the whole, them wanting to turn the business into a worker cooperative, and then all of a sudden him saying, no, we can't do that, and putting his foot down. I was just like, but you've made a career out of advocating for them, and then when the people who work there wanted to create one, you said no, because you still want to have a certain degree of control over the company, and like, it just, it left a bad taste in my mouth.
Amount of journalistic courage and integrity. Thank you so much for joining us today from Brazil.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. I believe this is my record-breaking, or maybe record-setting, third appearance on this podcast. So I think we agreed last time that if I came on again, I was going to have some kind of co-host rights, which I may exercise. But yeah, thanks for having me, Nathan. Thank you for doing it as well.
Okay, so we're here today because Nathan recently wrote an article critiquing both you, Glenn, and Matt Taibbi, who we recently also had on the show, about what he perceives to be some kind of ideological slippage that you've displayed of late, in which, and I'll let you put it in your own
Brianna
terms,
Greyjoy is
Nathan,
the
gist of it
moderator,
is that there seems to be a kind of a lack of skepticism about certain right-wing arguments that have been arguably embraced by you, Glenn. Nathan, how would you frame your core disagreement with Glenn?
So I wouldn't say ideological slippage exactly. You know, I've been an admirer of Glenn's work since I first started doing political writing. It was a big inspiration to me, and I would not say, as some people say, Glenn Greenwald has changed. I don't want to litigate that exactly. It may be just that I've noticed things that I disagree with that I didn't notice before. I'm not saying that Glenn has gone conservative, but that I have. And I tried to make this a substantive critique of a few points that I think that I see him making that I think are both wrong and frankly dangerous, and that sort of misunderstands the workings of power in the world. So, for example, I start with a discussion that he had with Glenn Beck, where he's talking about the authoritarianism of the Democratic Party. Now, I detest a lot of the Democratic Party. I'm a staunch critic of the Democratic Party. I've written books about Bill Clinton, endless stuff about Joe Biden, right? But, Glenn said to Glenn Beck that he couldn't agree more when Glenn Beck said the Democrats were fascistic for talking about the end of the filibuster, adding extra states, packing the Supreme Court. And Glenn Greenwald said that, ending the Senate is because a Democratic idea of ending the Senate is because they're a genuinely repressive and tyrannical party. Now, I think that's a complete misunderstanding of the situation, right? The Senate is the enemy of democracy. It was set up as the enemy of democracy. The idea of enfranchising Puerto Rico and D.C. and even of packing the Supreme Court is partly because the United States government is counter-majoritarian, counter-democratic, and has been that way since the beginning. I don't think these are signs of creeping authoritarianism by the Democratic Party. Frankly, the Democratic Party isn't going to abolish the Senate because, in fact, far from being authoritarian, they're mostly just ineffectual and useless. But if they did start taking these ideas seriously of getting rid of the filibuster and such, it would be a move towards democracy and not a move away from it. So, and when Glenn Greenwald said to Tucker Carlson in the advance of the 2020 election, the Democratic Party is likely to take over at least one branch of government, which is an alarming proposition because they are authoritarian. I think that actually Republican power is still more terrifying than Democratic power, and also that Republicans are stronger than they necessarily look. They're constantly trying to make themselves look weak, but in fact, they have functional veto power over pretty much any legislation, right? It's not possible to pass legislation without getting Republican agreements because of the filibuster. If you look at the state level, Republicans are trying to restrict abortion rights, deny healthcare to transgender youth, roll back voting rights, control school curricula, ban cities from imposing paid sick leave, all sorts of stuff. And Republicans try and create a narrative that the left are really...
Oh, you don't know who Nathan J. Robinson is? Nathan J. Robinson is the editor at, I think, editor-in-chief at Current Affairs magazine. It's a magazine that, Dave was a subscriber to for a very long time. We always had them at his place. It's a great magazine. I enjoy it. The only criticism I have of Nathan J. was that when his workers wanted to form a worker cooperative, he effectively stopped that. I think they're unionized. I think, like, at the very least, they've got a strong union, but he also was just worried about giving up control, I guess, of Current Affairs.
In control. Now, it's a quote from Matt Taibbi, who says that all the power is on the side opposite Fox News. Glenn has not said that in particular, but he has reinforced what I think is a mistaken understanding of American politics that doesn't see, because he has said that the threat of authoritarianism, for example, didn't come at all from Donald Trump. It comes more from the Democratic Party, which he has described as fascist. I think that, obviously I don't like the way that many Democrats are, show fealty of deference to the FBI, CIA, etc., and that ought to be criticized. But I think we really need to understand it. It's very important to be clear that, to my mind, I share Noam Chomsky's opinion that Donald Trump was one of the worst criminals in human history because of his acceleration towards climate disaster, because of his firing of inspectors general, because of his refusal to accept the election result, because of immigration, labor rights, every issue you want to take. The Republican Party's agenda is absolutely terrifying. And as bad as the Democrats are, I think it is really, really important to be clear on that distinction. And I think my critique of Glenn, my fundamental critique of Glenn, is that I see a lot of stuff attacking, sometimes, actual bad tendencies among liberals that I don't think recognizes just how bad that is. And in response to my critique, the things that Glenn said about me are like, the online liberal left, there's a quote, is trying desperately to show they're not like Chris Hayes. Nathan and those like him built their self-image on being radical leftists, different from their MSNBC watching parents, but now they struggle to find any differences. This is all they've got. But we don't give a shit about their dreary dogma or authoritarian culture and their captivity to the Democratic Party and are free for their repressive attempts to use in-group coercion to enforce adherence to trite liberal pieties. Now, I just think this is totally wrong. My parents would rather set themselves on fire than watch MSNBC.
Not gonna lie, credit where credit is due. That was pretty funny, Glenn. It's pretty funny.
Incredibly critical of the Democratic Party. And I just think that it's important to have a nuanced understanding. And I don't think that this attack on my motives really does service to what I think are substantive critiques of the positions that he's voiced.
So that was a lot. Glenn, do you have a reaction to any part of that?
Yeah. I think it's a good starting point. I think that first of all, if you listen to what Nathan said, there was a lot of kind of genuflecting to the idea that he views the Democratic Party as flawed, as doing bad things. He certainly has expressed criticisms in the past of figures like Bill and Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden. That's all certainly true. But if you listen to the worldview that he just laid out, it is a very pro-Democratic Party, anti-Republican Party worldview. It's something that would fit very comfortably within the confines of, say, MSNBC or CNN. They have leftists on there who, like Sam Cedar or Mehdi Hassan, whose basic worldview is what Nathan laid out, which is, look, I have my differences with the Democratic Party, but when push comes to shove, like when the rubber meets the road, you're damn right I'm going to be giving my support to the Democratic Party because they're much better and much less dangerous than the Republican Party is. I think that...
It's a difficult thing if you reduce it to that, because at the end of the day, I would say it needs to start local. It needs to start small, and it really does need to, I would support far leftist Democratic candidate over the, corporate Democratic candidate, if I was an American, is what I'm saying. And I would continue to advocate for that, for people to do that all the way up the ladder, right? If you think about it just in terms of the president, because at the highest level, or the governor, or whatever it's going to be, if it's going to be a position of absolute power, well, then yes, I'm usually going to say that for the purposes of harm reduction, I would say that Biden, while terrible, and while having all these things that are definitely going to happen under his tenure, would be not as bad as what was happening under Donald Trump, which has basically been my experience so far. But I'm also completely unimpressed and think that he's not delivering on any of the major promises that he said. He's not helping out, the American workers. There's no Fight for 15. There's no Green New Deal. There's just all these watered down after watered down bills. And an increase in military spending, continuing of the bombing of Somalia. There was, of course, drone strikes in Afghanistan as well. There's a dialing back of, I guess, American imperialism a wee bit. We lost the war in the war in Afghanistan. The U.S. finally withdrew from, even though that started under Trump. And there's been a dramatic decrease in the amount of drone strikes, like an overwhelmingly enormous decrease in the amount of drone strikes so far. Immigration, pretty much on par. Climate change, well, I mean, for immigration, there is the reuniting of families, so they are locked up, but they're still united. That's better. The crisis from Haitians was treated terribly. Wow, we could go on and on.
That's the basic framework in which Nathan resides. I mean, I don't think I'm putting words in his mouth. I think that's more or less what he said explicitly. And, I think that, and that's been Noam Chomsky's basic argument that he kind of rolls out once every 4 years as well, which is obviously I'm a critic of the Democratic Party, but at the end of the day, you have to vote for them because the Republican Party is worse.
Well, Glenn, do you think...
I think there's... So let me just make a couple points, just because of how much Nathan said, and also the lengthy article that he wrote that I haven't really addressed, although there was the article by Jonathan Cook, the former Guardian editor, that I think did a reporter that I think did a really good job of kind of isolating what he thought was driving these differences. So, first of all, I do think that one of the things we have to acknowledge is that politics has changed greatly because of the Trump years. There's really no denying that. I mean, you can see, for example, that alliances have shifted. Mm-hmm. Former Bush-Cheney operatives, like the worst ones, the people who were most hated by liberals throughout the war on terror, are now MSNBC hosts. Liberals poured money into the Lincoln Project, a group run by the slimiest scumbag GOP operatives like Steve Schmidt and Rick Wilson. Neocons are now explicitly Democrats, David Frum and Bill Kristol, Jen Rubin, Max Boot. You look at, liberal media outlets like MSNBC and CNN, and they're filled with nothing but ex-CIA operatives, FBI agents, federal prosecutors. These are the heroes, the kind of North Stars and icons of the Democratic Party, which was not really true 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Bill Kristol and David Frum were still Republicans, and now they're not. They're now Democrats. And so something has obviously changed in the word work. And then beyond that, you look at polling data where the huge gap exists between Republicans and Democrats on their views of institutions that Nathan referenced, but kind of dismissively so, but that I think are at the center of American political life. Things like the CIA and the FBI, Democrats and liberals hold those institutions, those security state institutions, in much higher esteem, much higher than Republicans do. There's almost no space in Democratic Party circles for criticism of the CIA and the FBI or the NSA or the Pentagon, as we saw this weekend when, General Miley, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, went before the Senate, and the only people who were criticizing him were on the right, and people on the left were kind of saying, this is outrageous. How can you criticize a war hero? I think it's not just the alliances, but the values that have shifted really a lot. So that analysis that would have applied in 2015 to whether Democrats are better than Republicans, I don't think is really quite applicable. And I think it shifted a lot of people's perspectives, because as the political framework around you shifts, so too does your perspective. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think one of the big differences that Nathan and I have is the question of what is power.
Say what you want, Glenn is right. The GOP is taking the working class. The Dems have the white collar. I mean, there are a handful of things that I agree with that Glenn Greenwald is saying here. Obviously, not everything, but it's important to kind of learn exactly where his worldview is, because I think to him, aligning more closely right now with, say, the GOP or the right-wing political party, because they are taking a larger or more critical view of all these government bodies that typically, yes, if you were opposing things like the war in Vietnam, for example, you would be also opposed to the CIA. You would also be opposed to the FBI. Whereas like the modern kind of like blue wave, I'm with her crowd, resistance crowd is obviously way more into like, the Mueller investigation and Russiagate and like, we love the FBI and they're going to save us from like the evil Trump and stuff like that. So there is truth to that, and that part of what he's saying, but that's libs again. That's liberal Democrats. I think if you talk to or speak to anyone on the left, especially even on the progressive wing, like Justice Democrats, the Bernie Sanders, the AOCs, all the stereotypical ones, and even the new ones that we're trying to get elected, like India, for example. All of them will be very strong critiques of the security state, of larger oversight needed for tons of different government bodies. The DSA, you name it, they would be probably pro Snowden. They would most likely be pro Chelsea Manning, stuff of that. That's going to be that's going to be where I would disagree, because I think the problem sometimes Glenn does is he lumps the Democratic Party as this corporate institution of which there's nothing that can be done. Those are the Democrats. I mean, Jimmy Dore does this as well. This is why Jimmy Dore is always talking about how we need and have to have a third party. I would be completely fine, by the way, with someone getting elected as a third party or as an independent for that matter, if they can get elected within that cycle. So if you are doing a local election, the person isn't necessarily running for the Democratic Party, I'm fine with that. Like, I'm not necessarily, like, I do not have allegiances to the Democratic Party. I do not have allegiances to, like, the NDP in Canada, for example. I would like the best possible candidate in a given riding to win, and the one who had the best, like, leftist views on any given topic, right? So if someone can do it like an independent senator from Vermont, I'm completely for that.
So, to me, the question is not that interesting. Like, is Donald Trump worse than Joe Biden? Or is Donald Trump, like, does he have worse views than Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi? For me, the question in politics is, who's likely to do the most damage? And I think one of the big divisions in liberal left politics is how you view Donald Trump. Like, did you view him as this kind of unprecedented, fascistic or even Hitlerian type figure who...
That was a really weird way of framing that, because he was like, I don't like when we have these conversations where it's not interesting to me who would be worse between Donald Trump or Joe Biden. To me, we have to look at who will do more damage. And now I'm going to compare Donald Trump and Joe Biden.
Was in this unprecedented way going to usher in fascism and pose an existential threat to American democracy? Because if the answer to that is yes, then I think it just...
Thoughts on the U.S. Green Party? Depends. That's a very broad question. Again, if there's a good candidate who's capable of getting elected and happens to be a part of the U.S. Green Party in a local election, then I would be completely for that. I would endorse them if they, again, would be competitive. But if it's like, on a state level, a federal level, a Green Party candidate who's got like a 1 in 100, million chance of winning the presidency, then like, yeah, I think pouring a whole bunch of energy into that or into that project would be most likely a waste of your time, I'm sorry to say. I mean, you can use it as an argument for maybe bringing awareness to a cause or having people talk about a cause. But I think if you had a far leftist candidate working for a third party that was rising to the levels of being like on the national stage, like on some plain, you'd also be close to achieving, I'd say, you'd need like other kinds of revolutions to be taking place. You'd need like people to be like emancipated in the workforce. They'd have to have more worker democracy, things like that. Like it would have to be a large scale adoption of some pretty far left ideas.
Justifies a whole range of things, not even justifies, but almost requires a whole range of views in order to combat it. You would want to fortify the FBI and the CIA and online censorship and domestic surveillance if you really believe that this political movement was about to destroy American democracy and implement actual fascism. Of course you would hug Bill Kristol and David Frum and John Brennan and Michael Hayden or whoever was on your side in battling against that. That would be rational to do. I never saw Trump that way. I see Trump as this like very weak figure who never got close to even trying to, let alone being able to, overcome the enormous institutional authority that exists in the United States that's designed to preserve status quo stability. And then the last point I wanted to make is just really quickly, Bree, is like when, like Nathan read several quotes of mine where I'm talking about Democrats being authoritarian and fascistic and the like. And, my leading examples are not things like wanting to do away with the Senate or anything like that. That was more like an example that I gave in that one interview of how Democrats will try and change any rules as long as they believe it's in their interest to do so. I don't think they're trying to get rid of the filibuster because they view it as a Jim Crow instrument. To the contrary, the Democrats also used the filibuster over and over and over and over again to prevent Republican majoritarian legislation when they were in the minority. I think they want to do DC statehood and get rid of the filibuster because it will help them. Now, what I'm talking about when I talk about authoritarianism is the fact that it is the case that the Democratic Party's coalition consists of not just the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and the Pentagon, who were radically against Donald Trump and therefore on the side of the Democrats, but also Wall Street and Silicon Valley. And the most disturbing incident for me, or one of them, that kind of is illustrative of why I say the Democrats are so authoritarian, is 3 weeks before the election, when the New York Post got its hands on an archive that was from the son of the presidential frontrunner, Joe Biden, that contained a lot of personal stuff that never should have been published, but a lot of stuff that reflected on his ethics and on his business dealings in places like China and Ukraine. The Democratic Party demanded that that story be censored, and Silicon Valley monopolists joined with the Democratic Party to literally censor and make it impossible to discuss that story on the internet. You couldn't post links to the New York Post story. You couldn't post links to any other media outlet that was posting it. The same thing happened after January 6th when Parler became the most popular app downloaded in all of the United States, and AOC and Ro Khanna went on Twitter and said, we demand that Apple and Google and Amazon, Silicon Valley monopolists, destroy Parler, and then overnight they did. So that to me is this union of state and corporate power, which is the classic definition of fascism, in order to shield Democratic Party authority from challenge. It doesn't mean I don't think there's authoritarian components to the Republican Party. It just means that I think the Democratic Party, in terms of these new coalitions that has formed in the Trump years, has become deeply authoritarian as well.
Just to interject, so I think that that's really a clear teeing up of the issues, but a few things, Glenn. I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan,
that was a lot of things. I don't know if you could, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know where you would genuinely make a correlation between the FBI and the CIA working with the Democratic Party like in their election cycle, or is he trying to say that because there's so many criminal investigations going into different members of Trump and his consortium, then that, because they are in power, technically means they're working for them? Like the same argument would be made if the Democrats, I guess, were the ones being investigated at any given time. Like what was the argument being done when Hillary was just being investigated consistently? I don't think I would have said the same thing, It's not exactly a sheer fear out of the pure power of these institutions, but that they are actually working in coalition with political parties. So he's reviewing an old debate. Well, it's like 4 months ago.
Have defended or would come out in defense of the NSA or the FBI or any aspect of the national security apparatus, though I think you're right, Glenn, that plenty of liberals do. And I say that just because I do think there's a bit of a conflating here happening between someone who is closer to a Mehdi Hasan MSNBC host, don't disrespect Mehdi, and Nathan, who I think there's space between me and Nathan, right? But I also don't think it's helpful
I totally agree with you. Like I think Mehdi would also, if I asked him, say that he thinks the CIA is a pernicious presence in American life. I have no doubt that Nathan would. I don't mean to imply at all that Nathan's a defender of the FBI and the CIA, but I think that that's a lot more important of an issue than Nathan does. Like, it plays a lot bigger role in my worldview than it does in his. That's why I spend a lot more time talking about the union between security state power, Silicon Valley monopolistic power, and the Democratic Party.
Right.
And it plays a big, so I don't mean at all to suggest that Nathan is a fan of the FBI. I don't think he's Bill Kristol. I think there's huge differences ideologically between Nathan and establishment liberals. But I think that the worldview that Nathan laid out, despite those differences, nonetheless brings him to the same destination as those other people.
So I think that's a really important point, because it seems to me that throughout a lot of this, it's a matter of where we put the emphasis and what we perceive to be the biggest threat. And Glenn, what seems to motivate you a lot, and which I frankly empathize with in my own work, is that I tend to be attracted to issues that not as many people are talking about, because it feels like that's where I'm most useful. And it feels like those are areas where there's a lot more potential for overreach and abuse, because people aren't watching them as closely. And I was frustrated similarly by the vote blue no matter who dynamic, and the fact that it really hinges on getting people to say and embrace the idea that Trump is worse, because that opens up a whole panoply of, like, a whole chain reaction that says, well, then if you agree that Trump is worse, you have to do this, that, and the other. And what that does is obscure other paths, other strategic avenues that one could go down if you didn't have that kind of absolutist framework. So Nathan, I wonder how you feel about the idea that the difference might be not substantive in many respects, but about this question of emphasis and whether it's necessary for someone to constantly emphasize that Trump does present some kind of threat in order to be credibly heard on other kinds of threats that exist.
Emphasis is actually an important description of I think, the core difference between Glenn and myself, because one of the reasons that I see, and again, that Chomsky saw Trump as the greatest criminal in human history, is because if your emphasis is on climate, if it's on labor rights, which Trump just shredded, if it's on the rights of immigrants, if it's on workplace safety, then Trump is obviously completely monstrous, and it's important to do a lot to stop him. Now, I don't accept, and it's often heard, and this was in Jonathan Cook's article too, this idea that if you think Donald Trump is one of the worst criminals in human history, it justifies doing anything to stop him. Now, the reason that it doesn't is precisely because we can see what the consequences of letting that justify almost anything would be, right? If you say, Trump is such a huge threat, thus we can do anything, including censorship, including mass murder, right? Where do you stop? And then you lose all of your principled commitments. So I think but I mean, again, and I share with Chomsky the belief that you can hold these two beliefs at the same time, which is that you don't have to downplay the very serious threat that Trump poses on all these issues that matter a lot to me. I understand why they are sort of, I don't want to say that Glenn cares about them less, but that, your focus has always been on a lot to do with surveillance, censorship, free speech, and such. But if that is your main focus, then it is understandable that for someone whose main focus is, for example, the fact that the West of the United States is about to be completely on fire, or the fact that buildings are collapsing in a deregulatory culture, right? We would have a very different view of what matters. I mean, I look at state legislatures and I see them currently trying to basically reshape school curricula for political reasons. That really, really deeply alarms me. So in some ways, we do just have a different focus, and that different focus gives us leads to a different assessment of how serious, in fact, the threat is.
Yeah, so just on that, a couple of things, I think, because it gets to one of the nubs of the different ways of looking at this. So Bree, I think what you said was very perceptive and also very important. I'm glad you brought that up, because I do want to emphasize that. It is true. When I started writing about politics, remember, I didn't have a media platform, right? I just created a blog.
Yeah, I've always liked current
affairs. And the reason I did that was because I thought there were things that were being ignored or overlooked that deserved attention. Not because I thought those issues were the most important issues. I was writing about Article 2 theories of executive power and the NSA scandal that broke when the New York Times reported that there was spying going on domestically without warrants. It didn't mean that I thought that was a more important issue than, say, income inequality or criminal justice, overly punitive criminal justice, things I ultimately did write about. I was writing about those things because I felt like that's where I could make an impact. That's where I could make a difference, because that was the stuff that nobody else was talking about. So when I go to sit, it's funny, I saw some video today that I did where I did a Democracy Now! Segment that somebody had posted about Russiagate, and there was 3 minutes of me saying that all the reasons why I thought Trump was this incredible menace, this grave threat to the functionality of a healthy democracy, why he was incredibly corrupt, things that I've said over and over and over and over again. Obviously I'm not a fan of Donald Trump's ideology, nor of his governance, but I look at the media world around me and I see that pretty much everyone outside of right-wing news outlets are waking up every day and doing nothing but saying over and over how Trump is this enormous threat. People are writing best-selling books about it. Republicans are saying it and becoming heroes of the liberal media. NBC, ABC, CBS, the New York Times op-ed page, the Washington Post op-ed page, the papers themselves are all dominated by that similar theme. So when I think about how I can best use my platform, I don't think about, well, let me go ahead and just echo what everyone else is already saying, because I don't think there's a lot of value in that. There may be value to me. My career would probably thrive more kind of seamlessly and effortlessly. I'd be less disliked or more well-liked if I were to do that. But in terms of the impact, I just don't think that would make a lot of impact. There's all this stuff about Trump being the gravest danger was being said by everybody, from like all those Republicans we just got done talking about to, Nancy Pelosi and Rachel Maddow, to Noam Chomsky and Nathan Robinson. That there was hardly like a need for me to be screaming from the rooftops about Trump's evil. And so instead, what I focused on were the things that I thought were being done to the Democratic Party in response to Trump that were incredibly dangerous, that were being overlooked, like really serious forms of authoritarianism, a revitalization of neocon ideology, and the FBI and the CIA as really dangerous institutions.
You know what I think actually explains the story or the whole Glenn Greenwald thing is I think that he started to get really pissed off too about the circles he used to probably either interact with that he was inside. And so he started going to a slightly more alt media end of things where he's like talking to people in the gray zone circles, the Jimmy Dores, the even the Joe Rogans, and because you were kind of in that ecosystem and you're appearing on the Fox shows consistently, talking on Tucker Carlson consistently or the other Fox programs, you're starting to get a lot more of like, you only hear this one side of each story where it's just like the Democrats have done this, the Democrats have done that, the Democrats have interacted this way. And he's gotten to a point now where he just sees them as the ultimate thing to be feared because of their close associations with big government agencies, the FBI, the CIA, all of them.
Interfering in our democracy. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I find it a little bit odd, this like sudden, or in Chomsky's case, not sudden at all, like this almost monomaniacal focus on climate as the reason that Trump, has to stand out as this grave evil. And I just had an email exchange with Chomsky where he defended that position by citing that argument again. Because the reality is that for 4 years, nobody was talking about climate. Nobody was talking about climate. Overwhelmingly, the threat that Trump posed, according to most media outlets, was Russia, was the fact that he was blackmailed by Russia, that he was controlled by Russia. And a big part of my split with the left, or liberalism, became that I just didn't think that was a real scandal from an evidentiary point of view. Like, I just didn't think it was true.
But okay, I wasn't as tuned in to Sam Cedar back around the height of Russiagate, but like I do not remember leftists being specifically the people propagating Russiagate. That was like a whole resistance thing. That was mainstream media. That was Keith Olbermann that doing that show on GQ. That was MSNBC with Rachel Maddow. That was ABC. That was CNN. That was their whole thing. That was the mainstream media, as they say.
That he was in bed with the Russians, that he had colluded with the Russians, that he was being controlled by the Russians.
But people on the left have never stopped being concerned about the environment, or I should say, like at times too doomery or terrified over the environment, which they shouldn't be. That would be a better criticism of it. But certainly, yeah. I mean, if you were looking at mainstream media during the height of Russiagate, he's right that mainstream media was talking about the Mueller report, because that was just like, that's interesting because the mainstream media never talks about the climate. There's never 24 cycle stories unless there's like a disaster. Unless there's a major disaster, that's when you suddenly see it. It's like, tragedy hits British Columbia as the entire province is on fire. Oh, whoa, tragedy hits British Columbia as the entire province is underwater. Oh, whoa, tragedy hits British Columbia as the entire province is under snow. Like, that's when you'll hear about it. But it's not like, they're not really talking about climate change outside of the disaster aspect. Like the disaster porn, that sells. That's just news. It's not like, so here is a list of things that every single one of us should be advocating for immediately to begin transforming the way we utilize, extract, and take energy and use it in a modern society, because we need energy, we need to use it, so let's have a responsible grown-up conversation about this, stop all these oils, etc. Like, you see where I'm going with this, right?
And I also thought it was an incredibly dangerous thing. So and one of my arguments all the time about Russiagate was all the stuff that Nathan just said. about deregulating the economy.
As far as the convictions over, do you guys think those people did nothing wrong? No. Like, okay, I think that there was hysteria. There was like a liberal hysteria and this view that Mueller and the institutions of the FBI and the CIA, like most of the FBI, were going to suddenly become these heroes to liberals, and that they were going to get Trump either arrested or he was going to be impeached, and it was only a matter of time. And every single day, everyone was so very focused on the Mueller report, the PP tapes, Russiagate. Yes, there is a handful of individuals that were convicted because of their association to different people and ties that they may have, people who had plenty of work and were doing work in Trump's campaign, for example. Was it just a one-to-one quid pro quo where someone was literally telling Russia from Putin that you were now going to get commands from the Kremlin? No, that's where the whole thing just became absurd. It was either that or it was just like, because they're fucking, because Putin loves his dick and they're slobbering on each other's cocks and all this other weird, like, homophobic, light, seasoning of the entire fucking thing. But like, yeah, there's that, obviously, and there is, like, General Flynn, everyone across the board who actually had credible ties. That there is your it's not even a gate. It's like these were politicians who had ties to either people in Ukraine or Russia who were trying, like, the whole thing was business more than it was trying to manipulate the U.S. government for the power and control of Putin. But anyways, that's where Glenn is correct in his reporting on that topic, because he was exposing a lot of it, like the people who took it so fucking far, and that was like the liberals and the resistance and like the blue rave Democrats who were like, yeah, this is it, we're gonna take down Trump, and the things that really piss me off about all that mentality is spending, and they're doing it now. January 6th was a real thing. It deserves its day in court. It should be investigated. The people who were responsible, all the way on up the ladder. Doesn't matter how powerful you are. I'm looking forward to Steve Bannon having to give his deposition, etc. I think that is all well and good, but that has to be met with action in terms of like what Democrats were doing since they've had power, not what the Republicans do, not the shitty things the Republicans do, because everyone knows that the Republicans are they're terrible, they do terrible things, right? And they're very good at that. What are the Democrats doing in terms of like helping people? I'm talking about like, increasing minimum wage, Medicare for all, or at least expanding the Affordable Care Act so that more people have it, more paid sick leave, having post-secondary education be paid for, student debt forgiveness, Green New Deals, green new energy sectors, maybe even getting and exploring nuclear power, things like this, right? Like, that's what should be met on the other side, not just the fucking resistance, these are evil, we crush them, resistance, these people are restricting our lives, they're restricting us via abortion access, we must crush them. It's cool, yes, we must crush them. I agree with the crushing, but also what's the alternative? You need to be giving people more than just like, oh well, we increase the military budget, so there's that. You're getting way more military. You like military, you spend more than the next like 10 countries combined. Most of those countries are allies, by the way, but you still spend more than the next 10, so you can get that. Yeah.
Part of the problem was all of that stuff was being drowned out because everybody was talking about Russia instead.
You did get $2,000.
I agree that Russiagate was all a bunch of bullshit. This is the problem, and I think one of my critiques of...
If you're taking notes, please make sure to bring up Tucker's doxing the journalists that were writing a negative story about him, and he said they were going to dox him and decided to dox him on a show. Then these journalists had people come to his house and take death threats and phone calls at home. Such a great person that Tucker. Fox in court to not take him, that Fox says in court to not take him seriously, but Glenn defends him. I take notes because in the heat of the moment I forget sometimes. I need to do an entire research into that story. The next one I was going to research, I guess, tomorrow and also tonight, is I've got the history of Tucker Carlson and his descent into pushing for the white replacement theory. I've got all of Glenn Greenwald's transcribes on his ivermectin and the fucked up people he's been promoting, including the FLCCC, and like all of the meta studies and data on that. But I don't have anything on that story. I'll make a note right now.
The approach you take here is to say, well, everyone's criticizing Trump all the time, therefore we're going to go in a different direction and examine the Democrats. But what you and I both know...
Hey, thanks, Confidence Man 2, with the tier 2. I'll let the robot say the message.
Long-time watcher, first-time subscriber.
Thanks, Confidence Man, too. Appreciate it, and I appreciate your confidence.
Is that the criticisms that were being made of Donald Trump were frequently the totally wrong criticisms. As you said, nobody was talking about climate. Noam Chomsky was talking. He's been talking about climate the whole time and saying, like, that is the reason Trump is such a serious threat. This Russia bullshit. So, yes, there's all this anti-Trump stuff, but it was totally unpersuasive, right? Trump came very close to winning re-election, and he did that in spite of the fact that, as you would point out, these news networks that nobody watches or cares about, MSNBC, CNN, right, are going like, Trump is a terrible threat, he's a terrible threat, but then the arguments they give are completely unpersuasive. So the approach that I've taken, and that I think Chomsky takes and is correct, is to say, no, what we need, I mean, I wrote a whole article called Bad Ways to Criticize Trump, and one of the reasons I did a whole book about Trump, Anatomy of a Monstrosity, is that I believed that all of the anti-Trump stuff was totally ineffectual.
I think one of the reasons I would write a book is not because I have a pressing desire to write a book, but just so I can shamelessly plug that book at all times. I love when people shamelessly plug their books, especially when they have them beside them or just holding them. And I mean, this is something I went into great detail, and I discussed in my new novel, The Goat's Milk and the Silver Chalice, and you could have a copy too if you wanted to, but like... Just seems
because
like a great
it was
power
not
move.
getting at the real sources of why the Trump's Republican agenda was such a serious threat.
But why do you think that is, Nathan? Why do you think that is? That if the Democrats care so much about climate and immigration and income inequality, they spend all their time talking about Russia instead of those things?
Because most of them don't care about anything.
I agree. Exactly. Exactly. I agree totally. They don't give a shit about those things. Yeah. Which is why, exactly. So, look, I think those things are dangers. Those things that you just described. We probably have differences on how dangerous they are and whatever, and how to best deal with them, and the like. But I
will say this, especially about climate change and the effects it's going to have on the United States, the world as a whole. They are going to be like eventually the interests of the security apparatus of the United States. Like they are going to eventually be in the self-interests of. How much do we need to militarize? How much do we need to defend our borders against this incoming amount of climate refugees that are coming here and they're trying to get across the border illegally? And now everyone's deadly afraid about this. And now we have food scarcity. And then food scarcity is going to be met with water scarcity. Is also going to be met with all these like climate refugees. So like all of those things will have a lot of concern for the things that you are also concerned about, apparently, Glenn. So like, the security state, the apparatus, the CIA, the FBI, all that kind of stuff. Like they're eventually going to have to start taking note on that. Like the CIA and the way they, try to control and manipulate the governments of other countries, especially in South and Central America, they're going to have to take a particular look at what exactly is causing mass migration to move from one country to the next as they move further away from the equator.
Also think, and this is, I guess, what has frustrated me a lot about this kind of discourse over the last 4 years is even if you think Trump is dangerous, like Trump is one power center in the United States. He's not, I don't even think he's close to the most powerful, even when he was president. But even if you want to say he was, there's tons of other power centers that were pushing it back against him all the time, and were doing very dangerous things as well, often in the name of undermining him. And that's what was getting so little attention. And in a lot of ways, American liberalism didn't just start ignoring that, but applauding it. Things like online censorship and, greater power in the hands of the FBI to track people they regard as domestic extremists, and joining with Wall Street and Silicon Valley. You say Trump almost won despite networks that nobody watches. It wasn't just despite that. It was Wall Street and Silicon Valley overwhelmingly funded the Democratic Party. Almost all institutional power was behind defeating Trump because they perceived him as this kind of unpredictable, unstable force. And so, I think that there were a lot of dangerous things being undertaken by this very powerful coalition aligned against Trump that was receiving way too little attention. And even with Trump gone, still is receiving too little attention.
But Nathan, I don't think he would disagree with.
I'm 19 and I live in Vancouver. Do you have any recommended groups or parties to look into? And I'm part of the COPE. I don't have any experience with them, so I don't know if I could recommend them. Are you looking specifically for a volunteer group, or are you looking to join like a political organization?
With any of that, would you, Nathan?
No, although I would say that I think some of it is a little illusory. Like I think a lot of opposition to Trump was discursive rather than substantive, and that ultimately, like, Trump is very, very good for the business community, right? Very few of them actually, they might detest him as like putting a very vulgar face on American capitalism.
I'm part of the Democratic Socialists of Vancouver, and my experience with them has been pretty overwhelmingly positive. There's also local chapters of the IWW that take place in Vancouver here as well. In terms of volunteer communities, there's like 3 or 4, but like I can't like think of the websites off the top of my head, but there should be an exclamation point what to do that I think we've compiled a handful of resources, including links to some of those orgs in the other chat. The only problem is my Nightbot is not working, but let me find that.
but he gave them their tax breaks.
Food Not Bombs is nice.
Him, but not much.
Yes, Food Not Bombs is I would recommend them internationally above most other groups, especially if you're starting out volunteering for the first time. Would definitely be Food Not Bombs, because it's what you get on the tin. It's very self-evident what they concentrate on.
There's actually not much done to undermine him. But other than that, a lot of those critiques I certainly agree with. Right, I got censored by The Guardian when I tried to write about Hunter Biden, so I know this firsthand.
That's why it seems to me that the issue isn't, and I don't, the issue does seem to be about this proportionality point, because I know, since I've had you as an editor, Nathan, I think that's something that you do that's very skillful, that makes it so that a lot of your arguments are heard by folks who might otherwise not hear them, is to put in a lot of caveats when you know you're going down a spicy road. So I remember writing, I think the first thing I ever wrote for Current Affairs, my article on identity politics, and the first 3 paragraphs are me talking about what identity is, why identity is relevant, what is and isn't identity politics, why it's important for people to be able to make political arguments on the basis of their historically marginalized groups, all of that kind of stuff before I dig into my critique of the weaponization of identity politics. And I think that gives a lot of...
The other conversation he had, I think, was a lot more beneficial. The one, I'm going to rewatch it again tomorrow just so I can transcribe all the best lines. But the one that he had recently with a very small creator, I mean, credit to Glenn there. He gave a much smaller creator than himself a huge platform by coming on there and taking all his flack. But the newest one he has, where it's answer criticisms about Tucker Carlson and everything, he put up on his site, and there you actually get to the meat of where Glenn Greenwald is either choosing to ignore the very obvious, what he considers to be a popular narrative about Tucker Carlson, that he is in fact a white supremacist that spreads the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. But he ignores it specifically for a handful of reasons. One, he thinks people have been taken out of context doing the clipping and shipping thing with Tucker. He believes, in essence, that the parts of the Great Replacement theory that Tucker talks about are related to voter demographics. And he says that he agrees with the idea that if you take one person and replace it with an immigrant, that person is most likely going to take another person's job, which is a very unusual way of framing the whole thing. Because ultimately it doesn't matter what study you look at, even what are considered to be centrist research institutes like Pew Research, they'll show you overwhelmingly that most countries like Canada and Canada and America, they both require a certain degree of immigration to replace an aging population. Our birth rates, maybe this is why it gets them excited. The birth rates in Canada, for example, do not match the rate of the aging population, so it needs immigration, and it's a net benefit to society, overwhelmingly.
This will come down to who can deliver the lower propensity and mid propensity voters.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and Peyton L. Just, we will build a ladder to heaven to deliver you the daily news. To our monarch, Tom Spiker, we are your most humble of clownish jesters. To our lords, Trevor R. and Alexander Thaler, you have our undying fealty. To our knights of the round table, Nate, that one guy, Hagbird Celine, Matthew Scarborough, Stellar Vision, Ariana McCarthy, Daniel Sutton, Ants Are Still Running the World, Coulter Smith, Tom Groh, Val 9000, Jenna Tal, Quiet 185, Anna Loves Riley, Riley and Anna, Omni, Poodlehawk, The Tim Caucus, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojack, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramon Acosta, Incosin, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Political Puppy, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We shall meet you in the tavern, and we raise a drink, and we salute you.